The Colorado sky was the color of old pewter the morning they buried Caleb Whitlock. Holden stood at the edge of the open grave with one hand on his daughter's shoulder and the other pressed flat against his thigh, holding it still. He had practiced not crying. He had practiced it the way a man practices anything he must do in front of other people. In the car on the way over, in the parking lot, in the back row of folding chairs, while the pastor spoke about a man the pastor had never really known. His grandfather had asked for a small service. His grandfather had gotten one. A handful of mourners, the wind moving through the lodgepole pines, the smell of wet earth and turned soil, a flag folded into a tight triangle and handed to no one in particular, because Caleb's only son, Holden's father, had died at 51 of a heart that quit on him without warning. So the flag came to Holden. He took it the way a man takes anything heavy, without a word. Wren was 9 years old and trying very hard to be a grown-up. She had brushed her own hair that morning. She had picked her own dress. She had asked Holden in the car if it was okay to be sad and quiet at the same time, or if she had to pick one. He had told her she could be both. He had told her that was the bravest thing a person could do. She slipped her small hand into his coat pocket as the casket was lowered, and Holden felt her fingers close around his wrist on the inside, where the skin was warm. He did not look down at her. He did not trust himself to look down at her. Across the grave stood his older brother, Garrett, 44 years old, in a charcoal suit that had cost more than Holden's car payment. Beside Garrett stood their sister, Marlene, 3 years younger than Garrett, and 3 years older than Holden, in a black coat tailored close to the body, her sunglasses on, though the sun had not come out. Neither of them was crying. Neither of them had cried in the chapel either. Holden did not judge them for it. He had spent a lifetime not judging them for things, and one more day was not going to break the habit. But he watched his sister look at her phone twice during the eulogy. He watched his brother glance at his watch. And he thought without meaning to of a morning 30 years ago when he was 8 years old, and his grandfather had taken him out on a small lake at 4:30 in the morning to fish for trout that had not yet learned to be careful. The boat had been older than Holden. The oars had creaked. The water had been so still that the stars were laid out across it like a second sky, and Holden had not understood that a boy could be inside a sky until that morning. His grandfather had not spoken for a long time. He had let the boat drift. He had let the silence do its work. And when the first pale line of light came over the eastern peaks, Caleb had said, in that quiet way of his, the way that made you lean in even when you were already listening, "You measure a man, Holden. You don't measure his money." The boy had asked how. The grandfather had said, "By the promises he keeps when nobody's looking." Holden had not understood it then. He had been 8. He had wanted a sandwich. But the sentence had stayed with him the way certain sentences stay, like a small stone in the shoe of memory that you cannot shake out and eventually stop trying to. The casket touched bottom. The earth went down on the lid in 3 handfuls. The wind moved through the pines, and Holden Whitlock, 38 years old, history teacher, divorced father of 1, watched the only man who had ever truly looked at him disappear into the ground. The reading of the will took place 6 days later in a wood-paneled office on the 11th floor of a building in downtown Denver. Edmund Halverson, the estate attorney, was a thin, gray man in his late 60s, with the kind of face that had seen 1,000 families come apart over money, and had stopped being surprised by any of it. He shook Holden's hand without smiling. He nodded once at Wren, who had been brought along because Holden's ex-wife, Bridget, had a deposition that morning, and there was no one else. "She can wait in the lobby," Halverson said. "She'll come in with me," Holden said. Halverson did not argue. The room smelled of old leather and lemon polish. Garrett was already seated, scrolling on his phone. Marlene sat with her legs crossed and a yellow legal pad balanced on her knee. She did not need the pad. She had already converted every line of the room into evidence. That was what she did. That was who she was. "Uncle Garrett," Wren said politely. "Hey, kiddo," Garrett said without looking up. "Aunt Marlene." "Hello, Wren." Marlene's voice was the temperature of a refrigerator with the door left open. Holden guided his daughter to the chair next to him and let her hand find his under the desk. Halverson opened a leather folder. He cleared his throat. He read the small bequests first, the way these things are always read. Charities. The housekeeper who had cooked for Caleb in his last years. A few $100s to a neighbor who had plowed the drive every winter without asking. Then he came to the substantial assets, and the room got very still. "To my grandson, Garrett Whitlock, I leave the lakeside property at Grand Lake, Colorado, including the residence and all furnishings therein, free and clear of any encumbrance." Garrett finally looked up from his phone. He did not smile. He did not need to. The lake house was worth $800,000 on a slow day. He gave a small nod, the kind a man gives when a deal closes the way he expected it to. "To my granddaughter, Marlene Whitlock Halloran, I leave the complete collection of antique mining equipment, ledgers, and historical artifacts, presently housed in the Denver storage facility, professionally appraised at $520,000. Marlene wrote a single number on her legal pad. She underlined it. She did not look up. Halverson paused, just for a beat, just long enough that Holden felt his own breath go thin. "To my grandson, Holden Whitlock," the attorney read, "I leave the sum of $5. Wren's hand tightened on her father's, and the original mountain property at Copper Ridge. 40 acres. One structure. Coordinates and deed enclosed. The silence lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then Garrett laughed. It wasn't a chuckle. It wasn't an embarrassed cough of a laugh. It was a full open, unguarded laugh that filled the wood-paneled room and bounced off the leather chairs and the framed diplomas. He laughed the way a man laughs at a joke he has been waiting all his life to hear. $5, Garrett said. He shook his head and grinned at the ceiling. $5 and that shack. Jesus, Hold. That's not an inheritance. That's an insult. Marlene did not laugh. Marlene did something worse. She glanced at Holden very briefly with the small, tucked-in satisfaction of a person who had been worried she might come out behind and had just been told she would not. "That cabin hasn't been lived in for 30 years, she said. Her voice was even and reasonable, and that was somehow the cruelest part of it. "It's not even worth the property taxes. I'm sorry, Holden, I am. But you should know what you're holding." "Tell you what," Garrett said. He was still grinning. He leaned forward and put both hands on the desk as if he were about to do Holden a favor. "I know some guys who do land clearance. I can probably get you a couple $1,000 for the lumber. Call it a family discount. We'll split the difference and you can take Wren somewhere nice. Disney, whatever." He winked at Wren when he said that. He actually winked. Holden did not move. He did not speak. He had spent the year of his divorce learning a particular discipline, which was the discipline of not letting his face do what his chest was doing. He kept his eyes on the attorney. He kept his daughter's hand in his. He felt the heat climb the back of his neck and stop the way heat stops at a closed window. "There are specific instructions," Halverson said quietly, "regarding the mountain property." "Oh, I bet there are," Garrett said. The deceased requested that Holden visit the site personally before making any decisions regarding the property's disposition. Disposition? Garrett laughed again, but smaller this time, like a man who had already gotten his big laugh and was now generous with the leftovers. "You mean before he sells the lumber?" That's the disposition." Halverson did not react. He had seen this room 1,000 times. He simply slid a thick manila envelope across the desk to Holden. "The deed is inside," he said. "There are no liens, no back taxes. Your grandfather kept the property current right up until the end." He paused. He lowered his voice just slightly. "He also asked me to give you this." Out of the inside pocket of his suit jacket, Halverson produced a smaller envelope, cream-colored, heavy paper. Holden's name written across the front in a hand he would have known in the dark. The room went quiet again. Even Garrett stopped grinning. "For me," Holden said. "For you." Marlene's pen stopped moving. "Is that a separate document?" she asked. "Is that part of the estate?" "It is a personal letter," Halverson said. "It has no legal force. It is not part of the will. He asked me to deliver it directly into Holden's hand." "I'd like a copy," Marlene said. "You may not have one." Marlene's mouth thinned. Holden took the envelope. He did not open it. He slid it carefully into his inside coat pocket, against the warm flat of his chest, where Wren could not see it, and his sister could not measure it, and his brother could not laugh at it. He set his hand briefly over the place where it rested, the way a man checks for his wallet without thinking. "Are we done?" Garrett asked, already standing. "We are done," Halverson said. Marlene rose. She gathered her legal pad. She turned to Holden as she passed his chair, and for a moment Holden thought she might say something kind. She had been a child once. She had been his sister once before. Whatever it was had hardened in her. "Don't spend the $5 in one place," she said. She kept walking. Garrett clapped Holden lightly on the shoulder on his way out. He did not mean it cruelly. That was almost worse. He genuinely thought he was being a good brother. "Call me about that Lumberby," he said. "I'm serious. I'll do you a solid." The door closed behind them. Holden sat in the chair for a long minute without moving. Wren sat with him. She did not ask any questions. She did not say anything at all. She just kept her hand in his and let him be a man for a minute longer than he needed to be one. Halverson watched them from across the desk. Then he removed his reading glasses and folded them with the care of a man for whom small motions had to do the work of larger feelings. "Mr. Whitlock," he said. Holden looked up. "Your grandfather spoke of you often." Holden swallowed. "Not highly enough to leave me anything of value, apparently." Halverson did not smile, but something in his face softened, and for a moment he was not an attorney. He was simply a tired man at the end of a long career looking across a desk at another man who did not yet understand what had been put in front of him. "Value," he said, "is a complicated word." He stood. He walked Holden and ran to the door. He shook Holden's hand a second time, and this time he held it a beat longer than the first. "Read the letter when you are alone," he said. "Read it twice, then drive up there. Do exactly what he asked." That was all. The drive back to Holden's apartment took 40 minutes, and Wren did not speak for the first 30. She watched the city slide past her window. She watched the tall buildings give way to the low ones, and the low ones give way to the strip malls, and the strip malls give way to the fenced-in apartment complex on the eastern edge of the suburbs, where her father lived now in the small 2-bedroom unit he had taken after the divorce, because it was what the budget allowed. When they pulled into his parking spot, she finally turned to him. "Daddy," she said. "Yeah, sweetheart." Uncle Garrett laughed. He did. "Why?" Holden killed the engine. He sat for a moment with his hands on the steering wheel. He had been a teacher long enough to know that 9-year-olds asked the questions adults were too polite to ask. and that the answers a man gave to those questions tended to be the answers he was actually living by, whether he liked it or not. Because, he said carefully, your uncle thinks the only thing that matters is how much something is worth in dollars. And Grandpa didn't think that. No, Grandpa didn't think that. So Uncle Garrett laughed because he thinks he won. Holden turned in his seat and looked at his daughter, 9 years old, hair pulled back tight, eyes so much like her mother's that they sometimes hurt to look at. And under the eyes that quiet, watchful steadiness that was hers alone, that had been hers since she was about 4. The steadiness of a child who had already understood that adults often did not know what they were doing. Yes, he said, that's exactly why. She thought about it for a moment. He didn't win, did he, Daddy? Holden did not answer right away. He did not have an answer yet. He had a feeling. He had the weight of an unopened envelope inside his coat. He had the words of an old attorney who had told him very carefully to read the letter twice and drive up there and do exactly what his grandfather had asked. He had a daughter who had seen her family laugh at her father in a wood-paneled room and who needed an answer that she would still believe in 20 years. I don't think he did, sweetheart, he said. I don't think he did at all. Her mother picked her up at 6. Holden walked her down to the curb and kissed the top of her head and watched her climb into the passenger side of Bridget's sedan, and he stood in the parking lot until the taillights had turned out of sight, the way he always did every Sunday and every other weekend for the past 2 years. Then he went back upstairs. He did not turn the lights on. He poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon and did not drink it. He set it on the kitchen counter and went to the small dining table by the window, and he laid the manila envelope on the left side and the cream envelope on the right side, and he sat down between them and put his hands flat on the wood. He thought about his grandfather's funeral. He thought about his brother's laugh. He thought about Wren's small fingers on the inside of his wrist as the casket went down. Then he opened the cream envelope. The paper was folded once. The handwriting was Caleb's, a little shakier than Holden remembered, but unmistakable. There was something else inside the envelope, too. Something heavy and small that slid into Holden's palm when he tipped it. A pocket watch. He had seen this watch 1,000 times. He had seen it on the kitchen table at his grandfather's house every morning of every summer he had ever spent there. He had watched Caleb wind it with 2 careful turns of his thumb and forefinger every night before he set it down beside the lamp. It was gold. The case was scratched in 100 small places, the way only a watch carried for a lifetime is scratched. It was warm in Holden's hand, though it had been in an envelope for a week. He turned it over. On the back, in tiny, deep-cut letters, his grandfather had had it engraved a long time ago, to Holden. Time reveals all truths. And below that, smaller still, a date. August 17th, 1955. Holden looked at the date for a long moment. He did not know what it was. It was not Caleb's birthday. It was not his own. It was not as far as he knew the date of any wedding or anniversary or mortgage. It was simply a date. It sat there deep in the gold like a key without a lock. He set the watch on the table. He opened the letter. Holden, it began. By now you know what I have left you. By now your brother and sister have made themselves clear. Don't let their laughter wound you. They see the world through a lens of immediate value of balance sheets and appraisals. You have always seen deeper. That is not a small thing. That is in fact the whole of it, all of. The mountain property is worth more than they can imagine, but not in the way they would measure worth. Go there. Take Wren if you are willing. Look carefully. Remember the things I told you when you were a boy. And remember that the things which appear worthless are often the ones we have hidden the most carefully. Trust yourself, Holden. Trust me. The watch will know when the time comes. I am proud of you. I have always been proud of you. Your grandfather. Holden read it twice the way Halverson had told him to. He read it a third time anyway. Then he sat very still in the dim apartment with the watch in his hand and the letter on the table, and he understood with the slow, clean certainty of a man who has just realized he was not where he thought he was, that something was happening to him that was much larger than $5 in a falling-down cabin. He did not know yet what it was. He only knew that his grandfather had not been confused, and his grandfather had not been cruel. He picked up his phone. He called his mother. She answered on the third ring the way she always did, because she screened her calls now because her arthritis was bad, and because, as she had told him once at her age, you stopped picking up the phone for anyone who did not earn it. Mom? Holden? How was it? The will. He had told her he was going. He had not told her he wanted her there. She had not offered. They had been like that gently and politely since his father's death. It went how he wanted it to go, I think. Meaning he left Garrett the lake house and Marlene the antiques and me $5 in a cabin. His mother was quiet on the other end of the line for a beat. Then she made a small sound that was not a laugh, but was related to one. A tired sound. The sound of a woman who had seen too many men do too many things over too many years to be surprised by any of them anymore. Did Garrett laugh? She asked. Yes. Did Marlene make a joke? Yes. Then your grandfather got it exactly right. He held the watch tighter in his hand. Mom, he said. He gave me a pocket watch. There's a date engraved on it. August 17th, 1955. Do you know what that is? There was a longer silence this time. His mother had been married to his father for 27 years. She had known Caleb for 35. She had lived for the first decade of her marriage on the edges of a family whose history she had only ever been told in pieces by people who had decided in advance which pieces she was allowed to know. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed. It was lower. It was careful in a way her voice almost never was. Holden, she said, there is something I should have told you. A long time ago. He sat down. He had not realized he had been standing. Tell me. August 17th, 1955 is the day your father was born. Okay. Holden. Yeah. Garrett and Marlene are not your full siblings. The apartment got very quiet. Outside, somewhere in the parking lot, a car door closed. A dog barked twice and stopped. Mom, they are your half-siblings. Your grandfather had a first wife. Her name was Eleanor. They married very young. She did not last in the mountains. She left him in the early 60s when Garrett was a toddler and Marlene was an infant. She remarried a businessman in Chicago and raised them in his house. They came back into your grandfather's life as teenagers. They were already who they were going to be by then. They were not raised by him. They were raised against him in a way. Why didn't he ever tell me? He didn't want you to look at them differently. He thought a child should choose his own siblings. He thought love was supposed to be a decision, not a piece of paperwork. He told me once, long after your father died, that he had hoped Garrett and Marlene would grow into the family. He said hope was a fool's currency, but it was the only one a grandfather had. Holden closed his eyes. He saw his brother's face across the wood-paneled desk. He saw his sister underline a number on a yellow legal pad. He saw his grandfather 8 years old in his memory in the boat at 4:30 in the morning saying, "You measure a man by the promises he keeps when nobody's looking." He had known in some unspoken place his whole life that something did not fit. That his brother and sister moved through their grandfather's house the way guests moved, and that he himself had moved through it the way a boy moved through his own kitchen. He had known, and he had not let himself know. "Mom," he said. "Yes. Thank you for telling me. I should have told you 20 years ago. Maybe, maybe not." He picked his time. He picked his time, she agreed quietly. That man always picked his time. He hung up. He sat at the small table for a long time with the watch in his hand. He did not feel rage exactly. He did not feel grief exactly. He felt the ground move the way ground moves when a man learns at 38 that the map he has been walking on was drawn by someone who had hidden half the country from him, out of kindness. He thought of Wren. He thought of what he was going to tell her about her family one day. He thought of his grandfather alone in a quiet house at the end of his life, sealing an envelope with his grandson's name on it, and choosing at last to give him the truth in pieces small enough to carry. He turned the watch over again, to Holden. Time reveals all truths. He understood now, or he understood part of it. The rest was waiting on a mountain. He picked up the phone and called his ex-wife. "Hi," he said when she answered. "Hi. I want to take Wren this weekend, to the cabin, the one Grandpa left me. It's about 3 hours up. I want her to see it." There was a pause. "Is it safe?" Bridget asked. Not unkindly, just practically. The way she asked everything now. "I'll make it safe." "Holden." "Yeah." "Are you okay?" He surprised himself. He laughed once very quietly. "I don't know yet," he said. "I think I might be." The drive up was the kind of drive a man does not realize he has been waiting his whole life to do. It was a Saturday morning. The sun was up early. Wren sat in the passenger seat with her backpack in her lap and her sneakers braced against the floorboard. And she watched the world unspool through the windshield the way a child watches a movie she has never seen. The suburbs gave way to ranchland. Ranchland gave way to foothills. Foothills gave way to the long climb into the high country, where the road turned to switchbacks, and the trees on either side grew taller and darker and older, and the cell signal after the second hour simply gave up. "We have no bars," Wren said, holding up Holden's phone. "That's all right. We're on a mountain road now. Up here, you don't need bars. What do you need? You need to remember the way." She thought about that for a while. "Did you remember the way? I remember most of it. The rest will come back." She turned in her seat and looked at him. She had a way of looking at him sometimes that was older than her face. It was the look of a child who had decided that her father was her project, that she was going to be careful with him, that she was going to bring him back from wherever he had gone in the last 2 years. If it took her until she was 20. "Daddy," she said. "Yeah. Why are we really going?" He did not answer at first. He kept his eyes on the road. He let the question sit between them like a third passenger. "Because Grandpa asked me to," he finally said, "and because I haven't done anything anyone asked me to do in a long time that mattered." Wren accepted that. She turned back to the window. The turnoff appeared so suddenly that he almost missed it. A narrow dirt road branching off the main highway marked only by a faded wooden post that he would not have seen if he had not been looking for it. He braked and the truck rocked, and Wren pressed both hands against the dashboard and laughed. And for the first time since the funeral, Holden heard his daughter laugh, and the sound went through him like warm water. The road climbed for 10 minutes more. The truck rocked over ruts and stones. The trees pressed in close, And then all at once the trees opened and there was a small clearing, and there was the cabin. He had remembered it as bigger. It sat low and tired in the clearing, listing slightly to one side the way an old man stands when his back is gone. The roof had lost shingles in patches like a head that had begun to lose its hair and stopped pretending otherwise. The porch had partly collapsed at one corner. The two front windows were so dirty they looked painted over. And behind the cabin, rising straight up out of the ground, like the wall of a fortress, was the granite face of the mountain itself. Holden killed the engine. He sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel. He did not get out. He let himself look. He had not been here in 23 years. "It's smaller than I remember," he said quietly. Wren leaned forward over her knees. She was not laughing now. She was studying the cabin the way she studied things that mattered. After a long minute, she spoke almost to herself. "It looks like a house from a story." "Does it? A story where the person who lives in it knows something nobody else knows." He looked at her. He looked at her for a long time. Then he opened the door. The porch held their weight, which was something. The front door hung crooked on its hinges, but it opened with a low groan, and they stepped inside, and the air inside was the air of a place that had been holding its breath for a long time. Dust. The mineral smell of cold stone. The faint, almost vanished memory of wood smoke from a stove that had not been lit in a generation. The cabin was a single room, 20 feet across, maybe a little less. A cast-iron pot-belly stove squatted in one corner, rust spreading down its flank like a slow stain. A simple wooden table sat in the middle of the room with one chair beside it. Open shelves along the back wall held a few tin cups, 2 enamel plates, and the brittle remains of what had once been a coffee tin. A narrow door frame in the rear wall opened into a small alcove where Holden remembered a cot had once been, and that was it. That was what Caleb Whitlock had loved enough to keep paying property taxes on for 60 years. Wren walked slowly around the room, her sneakers leaving small, clean prints in the gray dust. She did not speak. She did not touch anything. She moved the way a person moves through a church that has been empty for so long. It is no longer sure it is still a church. Holden stood by the table and watched her. "Grandpa loved this place," she said finally. "He did." "Then it's not what it looks like." "What do you mean?" She turned and looked at him. Her face was very serious. Her hand was on the back of the wooden chair. Grandpa was smart. He wouldn't love something that was just old and broken. He saw something here that other people didn't see. Holden felt his throat tighten. He nodded. He did not trust his voice yet. He went to work. He started with the stove, then the shelves, then the small alcove in the back. He moved the way he had taught himself to move at the worst stretches of his divorce, methodically 1 square foot at a time, refusing to be overwhelmed by the shape of the whole. The walls were solid. The timber was old, but not rotten. The roof had failed in 2 places, but the cabin itself had been built by someone who had built it to last past him. He was about to step back into the main room when Wren called from the alcove. "Daddy, come look." She was on her hands and knees in the corner, her cheek almost on the floor, peering between 2 of the rough plank boards. "What is it?" "There's something stuck down here." He knelt beside her. He angled his phone flashlight into the gap. Wedged between the boards, almost invisible under a film of old dust, was a small flat rectangle, metal, hinged. The kind of tin a man might once have kept tobacco in or tea or letters. It took him a few minutes to work it free. The metal was cold and heavier than it looked. He sat back on his heels and turned it over in his hands. and Wren leaned against his shoulder, breathing very quietly the way a child breathes when she does not want to break a moment. He opened it. Inside, wrapped in a square of waxed paper, were 3 photographs. The first showed Caleb as a young man, no older than 30, standing in front of this same cabin with 4 other men. They wore work clothes and battered hats. Their hands were hard. The man on the far left held what looked like a surveyor's tool. They were not posing. They were standing the way men stand when a photograph is taken of them in the middle of doing something. The second showed Caleb alone decades later in the same spot. He was holding something in his hands, but the photograph had faded along that edge, and the object was a pale ghost in the center of his palms. He was not smiling, but his mouth had that quiet upturn at the corner that Holden had grown up watching, the small, private smile of a man who had just confirmed something only he had needed to confirm. The third photograph stopped Holden's breath. It was a boy of about 10 in a flannel shirt and jeans with sun-bleached hair and a front tooth that had not yet grown in straight. He was standing inside the cabin right where Holden was kneeling now, and his grandfather was beside him. One hand laid on the boy's shoulder, both of them looking straight at the camera. Holden did not remember the photograph being taken. He had forgotten that the photograph existed, but he remembered the day. He remembered the day so clearly that it knocked something loose in his chest. "That's you," Wren whispered. "That's me. You look like me." "I do, don't I?" He stared at the boy in the photograph. He stared at the man beside the boy. He thought of all the summers he had spent here, 6 or 7 of them, before life and adolescence had pulled him down off this mountain and into a flatter version of himself. He thought of how his grandfather had taken him out alone again and again, year after year, while Garrett and Marlene refused to come, and his parents drove home, and how Caleb had taught him the names of stones and the names of stars and the names of certain promises. He thought of a sentence he had not thought of in 30 years. "You measure a man by the promises he keeps when nobody's looking." His grandfather had been keeping a promise on this mountain. A promise so old that the boy in the photograph had not been able to see it. A promise so private that even now, sitting in the cold cabin with his daughter beside him, Holden could feel it. The way a man feels the change in the weather before the clouds arrive. He set the photographs gently on the floorboards. Wren had moved away from him. She was kneeling a few feet off, her hands flat on the boards, her head cocked to one side the way a small animal cocks its head when it hears a sound the bigger animals have missed. "Daddy," she said. "Yeah. This board is loose." He turned. He looked at the floor where her hands were. He saw what she meant. The plank under her right hand was sitting just a hair higher than the boards on either side of it. It was nothing. It was the kind of nothing a grown man would have walked over 100 times without noticing. It was not 100 years old. It was newer wood than the rest of the floor. He came over to her on his knees. "Move back, sweetheart. Just a little." She moved. He worked his fingers into the gap. The board lifted with no resistance at all, as if it had been lifted and replaced many times before by a man who had wanted it to lift quietly and be put back without anyone noticing. He set the board aside. Below the floor, the planks ran the other way, crossways, newer still. And set into them, fitted flush with the underside of the floor, was a wooden hatch about 3 feet square, with a heavy iron ring set into its center. Beside the iron ring, built directly into the wood of the hatch itself, was an old combination lock. 3 brass dials, numbers worn smooth by a thumb that had set them many, many times. Holden stared at the hatch. He could hear his own pulse in his ears. "Daddy," Wren said, "I see it." "Is that a door?" "It's a door." To where? He did not answer. He sat back on his heels and he reached into his coat pocket and he drew out the gold pocket watch and he turned it over in his hand. To Holden, time reveals all truths. August 17th, 1955. 8, 1, 7, 5, 5. He looked at the lock. 3 dials, 3 numbers. His mother's voice came back to him gentle and tired on the phone the night before. August 17th, 1955 is the day your father was born. He set the dials. 9, no. He cleared them. He tried the first 3 digits. 8, 1, 7. He pulled the lock. It did not move. He cleared the dials again. He thought about it. 3 digits. The watch had 4 numbers before the year and 2 numbers in the year. The year alone was 2 numbers 55. That was only 2. He set the dials slowly, one at a time. 5, 5, 5. He held his breath. He pulled the lock. It clicked open in his hand. The hatch breathed up out of the floor with a low, dry exhale, the breath of a place that had been sealed against the world for a long time and had finally been remembered. Cold air came up out of the dark. It carried the smell of stone and iron and something else. Something Holden did not have a word for yet. Wren was very quiet beside him. He felt her small hand close around his sleeve, not in fear, but in the way a partner takes a partner's arm before stepping out into a room neither of them has ever entered. He did not lift the hatch all the way. Not yet. He looked down into the dark. He looked at the gold watch in his palm. He looked at his daughter watching him, and in the silence of that cabin on the mountain, his grandfather had loved enough to leave him at the cost of being laughed at by his own brother Holden Whitlock, understood finally and completely that the inheritance had not been the cabin. The inheritance had been the question waiting underneath it. He rose to his feet. He took Wren's hand. He stepped back from the open hatch and the cold breath rising out of it, and he spoke quietly the way Caleb used to speak when something mattered. "We're going to need flashlights, sweetheart," he said, "and rope, and the morning sun. Are we going down?" "Yes, but not today." "Why not today?" He looked one more time into the dark. "Because some doors," he said, "you only open once, and you want to be ready when you do." Outside, the wind moved through the lodgepole pines, the way it had moved at his grandfather's grave 6 days before. Inside, the gold watch ticked steadily in his palm, keeping time it had been keeping for 70 years, waiting the way it had always been, waiting for the man who would finally know what to do with it. They drove down off the mountain in a different silence than the one they had driven up in. Wren sat with her knees pulled up against the dashboard and her hands wrapped around her seatbelt strap, the way she did when she was thinking very hard about something and did not want to be interrupted. Holden kept his eyes on the road. The sun had begun to slide down the western sky, and the long shadows of the pines fell across the dirt track in bars like the shadows of fence posts, like the bars of something a man was being driven gently in or out of. He did not speak until they reached the first stretch of paved road. "Sweetheart, yeah, what we found today, in the cabin. The door under the floor. The door under the floor. I need you to keep that between you and me, for now." She did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the trees. Because of Uncle Garrett. Because of Uncle Garrett and Aunt Marlene. They wouldn't understand. They would understand, Holden said carefully, but they would understand it wrong. She thought about that for a long time. Then she nodded once, the small, definite nod of a child accepting a job she had decided to take seriously. "Okay, Daddy." "Thank you, sweetheart." The town of Copper Hollow was the kind of town a man drives through twice without noticing unless he is looking for it. A single main street 4 blocks long. A post office with a flag and a flagpole that needed paint. A diner whose neon sign had not lit fully since the second Bush administration. A general store on the corner, 2 stories tall with old brick at the bottom and old wood at the top. And a hand-painted sign over the door that read simply in faded white letters, Hargroves. Holden parked the truck across the street. A small bell rang as they pushed through the door. The smell inside was the smell of old places that had been cared for, cedar and dust and coffee, that had been sitting in a pot for longer than was strictly polite. Shelves ran from floor to ceiling, hardware on the left, dry goods on the right. A wood stove in the back, cold this early in the season, but ready. Behind the counter, a man looked up. He was in his mid-70s, lean as a fence rail, with white hair cropped close to his skull, and the kind of weathered face that came from 60 winters at altitude. His eyes were a sharp, pale blue, and they took in Holden and Wren in a single quick sweep, the way a man who has spent his life behind a counter takes in customers, weighing them not for their money, but for what they were going to need. "Help you folks," he said. "We need some supplies," Holden said. 2 heavy flashlights, rope, batteries, a first aid kit, maybe a couple lanterns if you have them. The old man did not move from behind the counter. "Camping," he said. It was not a question. "Hiking mostly." "Up where?" Holden hesitated. He felt Wren's hand find the back of his coat. "My grandfather had a property up the ridge. I came up to see it." The old man's eyes did not change, but something in the way he was standing changed almost imperceptibly. He set both hands flat on the wooden counter, the way an older man steadies himself when the floor under him has just shifted slightly. "What was your grandfather's name, son?" "Caleb. Caleb Whitlock." The old man was silent for a long beat. Then he came out from behind the counter. He walked around with the careful, slightly stiff gait of a man whose knees had earned the right to be careful. He stopped in front of Holden. He looked him up and down, not rudely, but the way a man looks at a face he has been waiting to see, without knowing he had been waiting. "You're the grandson," he said. "Yes, sir." "Holden." "Yes, sir." The old man nodded once. He extended his hand. The hand was hard and dry and stronger than it looked. "Ellis Hargrove. I knew your grandfather 30 years. Holden shook his hand. He did not know what to say. The old man saved him the trouble. "Heard he passed. 3 weeks ago. I'm sorry." "Thank you." Ellis crouched down, slow and careful, until his face was level with Wren's. He did not smile. He did not pretend. He simply looked at her the way a grandfather looks at a child he has been told about but never met. "And who's this?" "This is my daughter, Wren." "Wren," Ellis said. "That's a fine name. Smallest bird in the woods, but it sings the loudest. You knew that." Wren shook her head solemnly. "Well, now you do." He stood with effort and went back behind the counter. He gathered the supplies without being asked again. He moved through the store with the unconscious efficiency of a man who knew where every nail and every length of cord was kept, who had probably stocked the shelves himself for 40 years. He set the items on the counter one by one. 2 flashlights, the kind with the long handles and the rubber grips, the kind a man trusted. A coil of climbing rope. A box of batteries. A first aid kit in a red metal tin. 2 propane lanterns, fresh canisters. He rang it up. He named a price. Holden paid in cash. When Holden picked up the bag, Ellis Hargrove did not let go of his end of the receipt. "Son," he said quietly. Holden looked up. The old man's pale blue eyes were steady on his. "Your grandfather came through this store every few months for as long as I've owned it. Sometimes every week when he was younger. He'd buy hardware. He'd buy lumber sometimes. Survey gear. Rock hammers. Specialty bits for a hand drill that nobody around here uses anymore. He didn't camp. I never sold that man a tent. He didn't fish. I never sold him a hook." Ellis paused. "He came up this mountain to do a thing. I don't know what the thing was. I never asked. He never told me. A man's entitled to his quiet." He let go of the receipt. "But I'll tell you this. Whatever it was, he meant it. He meant it the way old men mean things when they don't have a lot of years left to mean them in." Holden found his voice. "Did anybody ever come up there with him?" "No." "Anybody from the family?" "No son, not a soul. He came alone every time. Sometimes he'd stay a week. Once about 10 years back, he stayed near a month. I didn't see him in town the whole time. I was about ready to send somebody up to look, and then he came in for coffee one morning like nothing had happened." Ellis looked past Holden out the front window at the long shadow of the late afternoon falling across his street. "Whatever's up there," he said, "he was getting it ready for somebody. I figured it'd be one of you. I'm glad it's you." They slept that night at the small motel on the edge of town. 6 rooms. A neon sign with a missing letter. A clean, plain bed and a bedside lamp, and a window that looked out onto the parking lot, and beyond it, in the gathering dark, the great black shoulder of the mountain. Wren fell asleep first. She slept the way 9-year-olds sleep deeply, and immediately with one arm thrown above her head, as if she had surrendered. Holden stood at the window for a long time. He held his grandfather's pocket watch in his palm. He turned it over and ran his thumb across the engraved letters. "Time reveals all truths." He had spent the last 2 years feeling like a man who had failed at every important thing in his life. He had failed at his marriage. He had failed at being the kind of father who got to tuck his daughter in every night. He had failed at being the kind of man his father had wanted him to be. And his father had not even been alive to see most of the failure. But his grandfather had not seen failure. His grandfather had looked at him and had seen something specific, and had built a life of small, quiet preparations around the certainty that one day, this grandson, this one would come up a mountain and open a door. He set the watch on the nightstand. He lay down on his back on the motel bed, fully dressed with his hands folded over his chest. He listened to his daughter breathe. He did not sleep for a long time. The morning came clear and cold. They ate breakfast in the diner. Pancakes for Wren. Coffee and eggs for Holden. The waitress, a stout woman named Marge, with hair the color of a steel wool pad, took one look at Holden and said, "You're Caleb's grandson." "Yes, ma'am." He always took his coffee black. No sugar, no milk. He used to say sweetening coffee was for people who hadn't lived enough yet. She poured Holden's cup and walked away without waiting for an answer. They drove back up the dirt road. The truck climbed the same switchbacks. But they felt different now. The way a road feels different on the second day, when a man has begun to understand where it is taking him. Wren did not speak. She had her backpack between her feet, and inside the backpack she had packed of her own initiative. A notebook, a pencil, a granola bar, and her grandfather's photograph of Holden as a boy. She had asked permission. He had said yes. They reached the cabin. They got out of the truck. In the daylight, with their work boots and their flashlights and the coil of rope across Holden's shoulder, the cabin looked almost businesslike. The porch sagged. The windows were filthy. But the place no longer looked like a ruin. It looked like a station, a waiting room, a door that had been keeping its appointment for a long time. They went inside. Holden lifted the loose floorboards he had set aside the day before. The hatch was where he had left it. The combination lock dangled open from its hasp. He turned to his daughter. "I'm going down first." "I know. You stay up here. You stay right by the open hatch where I can hear you." "I know, Daddy. If I call up to you, you answer. If I don't answer when you call down to me, you wait 5 minutes by the watch in the truck, and then you walk back down to the road, and you walk to the highway and you flag the first car you see, and you tell them your father's hurt. You don't try to come down after me." "Okay. Promise me." "I promise." He looked at her for a long moment. He set the second flashlight in her hand. She gripped it with both hands. "I love you, sweetheart." "I love you, Daddy." He turned. He sat on the edge of the open hatch with his legs dangling into the cold mouth of it. He thumbed his flashlight on. He swung the beam down into the dark. The light fell on a wooden ladder. The ladder ran straight down along the rock face of a vertical shaft. The rungs were thick and old, but they had been bolted into the granite with iron brackets that looked, even from above, no more than a few decades old. Someone had maintained this. Someone had cared. Holden took a slow breath. He set his foot on the first rung. He tested it with his weight. It held. He went down. The shaft was deeper than it had looked. He counted the rungs as he descended the way a man counts steps in the dark to give himself something to hold on to. 20. 25. 30. The cold rose up around him as he went. The smell of mineral and stone, the smell of an old earth that had not been breathed by anything human in a long, long time. His boots touched flat ground at 32 rungs. He stood very still. He let his eyes adjust. He swept the flashlight beam in a slow arc. He was standing in a tunnel. It was hand-cut. The marks of the tool were still on the walls. 1,000 small chevrons left by 1,000 small hammer blows, the signature of a man working alone with a hand drill and a chisel, and a great deal of time. The ceiling was about 7 feet high. The walls were granite, dark and tight-grained, the kind of rock that did not give itself up easily. Heavy timber beams supported the ceiling at regular intervals. The floor underfoot was worn smooth the way a doorstep is worn smooth by years of feet that had crossed it again and again. This was not a cellar. This was a mine. He found his voice and called up. "Wren." "Yes, Daddy." "I'm down. I'm fine. There's a tunnel. I'm going to walk it a little ways. Stay where you are." "Okay." He walked. The tunnel ran straight for perhaps 50 yards. Holden moved slowly, the flashlight beam sweeping ahead of him, the soles of his boots making almost no sound on the smooth stone floor. He passed 3 timber supports. The middle one was newer than the others, the wood paler, the brackets cleaner. His grandfather had been replacing them, one at a time, year by year. A man past 80 alone on this mountain with a length of new lumber and a bag of bolts, and the patience of a man who had decided what mattered. The tunnel opened into a chamber. It was the size of a small barn. The ceiling rose to 12 feet. Tool marks were visible everywhere. Along one wall, a darker streak ran through the rock, a vein the width of a man's wrist, with small bright glints along its length. Against the far wall, stacked carefully on a low wooden platform, were 3 crates. They were old. The wood was dark with age, but they had been kept dry, kept off the floor, kept the way a man keeps things he means to come back to. Holden approached the crates the way he would have approached a sleeping animal. He set the flashlight on the platform so that the beam threw a soft circle of light across the wood. He worked the lid of the first crate up with his fingers. The crate was full of stones, not common stones. He could see that at a glance. The stones had been carefully wrapped, each one in a square of waxed cloth. He lifted the topmost one. The cloth fell open in his hand. The flashlight beam caught it, and the chamber filled very briefly with a small private dawn. Silver, but not silver as Holden had ever seen it. Not the dull gray of old coins. This was silver in its native form, threading through the dark host rock in delicate twisting filaments, like the work of a metalsmith who had been told to imitate the way a vine grows and had succeeded. Wire silver. He had read about it somewhere long ago in some textbook. He had never expected to hold a piece of it in his hand. He set the stone down very carefully. He opened the second crate. Tools, hand tools, a miner's pick with the wood of its handle gone dark with sweat and time. A short-handled chisel, a small steel wedge. The implements of a man working alone with no one to help him and no one to ask. He opened the third crate. The third crate was different, smaller, more carefully made. The wood inside had been lined with what looked like oilcloth, and resting on the oilcloth, wrapped in another square of waxed paper, was a leather-bound book. Holden lifted it out. The leather was cracked along the spine, but the binding still held. The pages, when he opened the book, were yellowed but legible, the ink brown with age. The handwriting careful and educated, the hand of a man who had been schooled before he came west. He turned to the first page. Journal of Ezra Thornberry, March 1897. His own hands shook. He sat down on the edge of the wooden platform with the journal open across his knees, and he began by the cold beam of the flashlight to read the words of a dead man who had stood in this chamber 127 years before him. The early entries were practical. Travel notes from the journey out from St. Louis. A description of the country. The names of the men Ezra had met on the road, and which of them he had decided to trust. The first mention of the strike in May of 1897 was matter of fact and almost shy the entry of a man who did not yet trust his own good fortune. I have staked my claim today. The vein runs deeper than I dared hope. There are signs on the stone that other men were here long before me. I do not yet know what to make of these signs. The entries went on. Months, then years. Ezra worked alone. He kept the location quiet. He shipped small amounts of the silver to a buyer in Denver under a false name, enough to live on, never enough to draw attention. Then in the summer of 1899, the tone of the journal began to change. They are watching, Ezra had written. Carson's men, perhaps, or the syndicate. Someone has heard. I must be more careful now. I must hide what is best. The entries grew shorter, more clipped. A man writing as if every line might be the last. And then in the heart of the journal, 3 pages had been torn out. The ragged edges still showed where the paper had been pulled clean deliberately by the same hand that had written the rest. After that, only a few entries remained. I have hidden it where only blood will find it. The mountain keeps its promises. If I am found, let it be known I broke no laws and harmed no man. The wealth of the earth belongs to those with the courage to seek it and the wisdom to protect it. The last page held only one line. I leave this for whoever comes after me. That was all. Holden closed the journal. He sat for a long time with it on his knees in the cold, dark chamber. Above him somewhere his daughter was sitting cross-legged by an open hole in a cabin floor, with a flashlight in her lap, waiting for him to come back up. Below him somewhere the mountain went on into its own dark, and the truth his grandfather had left for him went on deeper. The way truth always goes, deeper than the place a man first finds it. He carried the journal back up. He came up the ladder slowly, the leather book buttoned inside his coat, the photograph of his 10-year-old self in his shirt pocket against his heart. When his head broke into the daylight of the cabin, Wren was sitting exactly where he had left her. Cross-legged, the flashlight beam pointed politely at the wall, so as not to blind him as he came up. "Daddy, I'm here." She did not run to him. She waited until he had pulled himself fully out of the hatch and sat on the floor beside her. Then she leaned her small body into his side and put her head on his shoulder. "What's down there?" she asked. "A tunnel, a room, some old crates, and a book." "What's in the book?" He looked at her. He thought about how to say it. A man named Ezra Thornbury wrote it a long time ago, 127 years ago. He found something in this mountain, something he thought he had to protect. He left a few pieces of it down there for whoever came after him. And Grandpa was the one who came. Grandpa was one of them, sweetheart. And now I think we are too. Wren considered this. "Are we going to tell Uncle Garrett?" "No." "Aunt Marlene?" "No." "Why not?" He took a long breath. He looked at the cabin around them, at the cold stove and the dust and the photograph he had set carefully on the table. He looked at his daughter. Because, he said, a thing can be very valuable, and it can also be very fragile, and the two things often live in the same place. Until I know how to take care of what we found, I don't want to put it in front of people who would only see what they can take. She understood. He could see her understanding it. "Okay, Daddy." He drove the long way back to Denver the next morning with one of the wrapped stones from the crate in a sock in his glove box. He had not slept. He had read the journal 3 more times in the motel room. He had photographed every page on his phone. He had backed the photographs up to 2 cloud accounts and emailed them to himself. He was a history teacher. He understood how easily a paper record could vanish. He understood that a man who had found something old in an old place had to first make sure the record could not be erased. He left the stone with a man named Theodore Bishop. Bishop was a retired geologist. He lived in a modest brick house in a quiet neighborhood on the north side of Denver. Holden had found him through a paper Bishop had written 20 years before on Colorado native silver formations, and through 3 careful phone calls. Bishop was 74. He had no children. He had no living spouse. He had, as he said himself on the phone, no one left to lie to and no reason to lie to anyone else. He was tall and slightly stooped, with a head of wild white hair that stood up from his scalp, as if it had been startled and never recovered. His eyes were sharp behind thick glasses. He shook Holden's hand once and led him into a basement that had been converted decades ago into a working laboratory. Microscopes, test equipment, shelves of rock samples labeled in a neat, upright hand. Holden set the wrapped stone on a clean white cloth. Bishop looked at it for a long moment without touching it. "Where?" he said. "Property I inherited. Mineral rights. Mine free and clear." Bishop unwrapped the stone with the slow, careful fingers of a man who had done this work his whole life. He held it under a strong lamp. He turned it over. He examined a single bright filament under a hand lens. He took it to the microscope. He was silent for a long time. When he sat back at last, he removed his glasses and cleaned them on his shirt with absolute attention, as if cleaning the glasses were the most important task left in the room. "Mr. Whitlock," he said. "Yes, sir. This is museum-grade native silver. It is one of the cleanest samples I have seen in 50 years. Holden waited. "For the sample alone, you are looking at $3 to $5 million. Possibly more, depending on how it presents at full size and how its provenance documents. I would have to see the rest of what you have." Holden's mouth had gone dry. And if there's a vein, Bishop looked at him steadily over the rims of his glasses. If there is a vein producing material of this quality in any meaningful quantity, you are not looking at a sample. You are looking at one of the last undiscovered silver deposits in the Rocky Mountain region. A conservative estimate would be $15 to $20 million. A less conservative estimate would be considerably more. The basement was silent except for the ticking of an old wall clock. Holden sat down on a stool he had not realized was behind him. "Why are you telling me this so directly?" he said after a long minute. "Most people would offer to broker or to partner." Bishop almost smiled. It was the smile of a man who had been complimented by accident. "Because I am 74 years old," he said, "and I have everything I want, and most of what I do not want is no longer available for purchase. I would like to see your property because I would like to see with my own eyes one true thing before I am done. That is the entire fee. You can take it or not." Holden took it. "I would like that very much, sir." He drove back to his apartment that afternoon with the stone wrapped again and locked in the glove box and the journal in a fireproof bag and a cooler in the back seat. He pulled into his parking spot. He sat in the truck with both hands on the wheel. His phone rang. He did not need to look at the screen to know. "Garrett." "Hold, where you been? I've called you 4 times. "I've been busy." "Busy, right. You and your busy life teaching 7th graders the Bill of Rights. Listen, Marlene and I have been talking." Holden closed his eyes. "About the will. Hold, the will isn't fair. Even you can see that. Grandpa wasn't right at the end. We all knew it. He was right at the end. His attorney has the medical paperwork. His attorney is a man we are paying to say what he's saying. Listen to me. We are prepared to be reasonable. We will take care of you. $50,000 cash for your share of the estate. You sign over the cabin. We move on. You take Ren somewhere. You start fresh." The kindness in his brother's voice was almost the worst part. Garrett genuinely thought he was rescuing his younger brother from his own poor judgment. Garrett genuinely thought $50,000 was a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. Holden opened his eyes and looked at the apartment building in front of him. 3 stories. Beige stucco. The windows of his unit on the 2nd floor with the cheap blinds Bridget had picked out in another life. "Garrett." "Yeah." "No." There was a small dangerous silence on the line. "Hold." "No." "Did you find something up there?" "I found a cabin. I found my grandfather's photograph. I found a piece of my own childhood I had forgotten. That's enough." "You're lying to me." "I am ending this call." "Hold, I'm not gonna ask again." "That's a relief." He hung up. His hands were shaking when he set the phone down on the passenger seat, not from fear, from something else. From the small, clean shock of a man who had said no to his older brother and discovered that the floor was still under him. The phone rang again almost immediately. Marlene. He let it go to voicemail. It rang again. Marlene. He let it go again. 3 minutes later, a text came in. He read it once and put the phone face down on the seat. "You always were the soft one. Last chance to be reasonable. After this, it gets expensive." He sat in the truck for a long time. The sun went down behind the apartment building. The parking lot lamps came on one by one in the orange of old sodium. He thought of his grandfather's voice in the boat at 4:30 in the morning. He thought of a sentence Caleb had said once late one summer, when Holden had been about 14 and had come up to the cabin alone with him for the last time. "There are men," Caleb had said, "who measure their lives by what they take. And there are men who measure their lives by what they refuse to take. The first kind sleep better. The second kind die better. You will have to choose Holden." He got out of the truck. He took the stone and the journal and the photograph, and he carried them up to his apartment. The next weekend, he and Theodore Bishop drove up to the cabin together. Bishop brought a battered pickup truck full of equipment, ground-penetrating radar, a portable mineral analyzer, a theodolite. He said almost nothing on the drive up. He looked at the country with the same patient attention he had given to the silver sample. When they reached the cabin, he stood for a long minute in the clearing and simply looked at it the way a man looks at a building that is older than he is and has outlasted men he has loved. "He picked his spot," Bishop said. "Yes, sir. Quite enough to keep secrets in." That seems to have been the point. Bishop spent 2 days in the mine. He moved through the tunnel and the chamber with the unhurried thoroughness of a man for whom haste had never been a virtue. He measured. He sampled. He pressed a hand against the host rock and listened the way old doctors used to listen to chests. He asked Holden very few questions. The questions he did ask, he asked twice in slightly different words and noted both answers. On the evening of the second day, they sat together on the porch of the cabin with mugs of bad motel coffee in their hands and the great red sun going down behind the western peaks. "The vein continues," Bishop said. "How far?" "At least 400 feet beyond what we walked. Possibly considerably more. The host rock is consistent. The grade is consistent. There is a strong upward indication along the eastern wall of the chamber that I would want to follow, but not without proper safety equipment." He turned the cup in his hands. "This is one of the last significant undiscovered deposits in the Rocky Mountain region. Your grandfather knew. He had to have known. He spent decades documenting this site. He could have mined it. He had the access. He had the privacy. He had the years. But he didn't. No. Why?" Bishop looked at him. "That is not a question for a geologist, Mr. Whitlock. That is a question for the man you are going to become." They drove down to the highway in 2 trucks. They were nearly to the main road when they came around the last bend and saw the 3 cars parked across the dirt track at the bottom of the hill. Garrett's black SUV, Marlene's silver sedan, and a third, smaller, unfamiliar car with a man standing beside it, holding a long-lensed camera at his hip. Holden braked. Bishop pulled up behind him. Holden got out of the truck. His brother was leaning against the side of the SUV with his arms crossed the way a man leans when he wants to be seen leaning. Marlene stood a few feet away wearing low boots and a long coat, and an expression Holden had not seen on her face since they were teenagers. The close-focused expression of a person who had decided that something was hers and was preparing to take it. "Hold," Garrett said. "You're on my road." "Easement," Marlene said. "Public access. Read your deed." "I have read my deed." "Then you know we are within our rights to be here," she said. "We are documenting the property condition. For legal purposes." The man with the camera lifted it and took a picture of Holden, then a picture of Bishop's truck, then a picture of the dirt road climbing up toward the cabin. Holden walked forward until he was 3 feet from his sister. "Marlene, Holden, you and Garrett that are going to back your cars off this road. You are going to take your photographer, and you are going to leave. Or what? Or I am going to call the sheriff and report a trespass." Garrett laughed. It was a smaller laugh than the one in the attorney's office, but it was the same laugh, the laugh of a man who genuinely believed his younger brother could not hurt him. That the rules they were both pretending to play by were rules the older brother had learned long ago to bend. "Sheriff's a friend of mine, Hold." "He's not a friend of yours. He's a friend of the man who sent you a Christmas card. Those are different things. Marlene stepped closer. She was almost as tall as Holden. Her eyes were colorless in the late afternoon light. "We are filing the suit Monday," she said quietly. "Undue influence, diminished capacity. We have signed declarations from 2 of his physicians. We have sworn affidavits from a former housekeeper. We will tie this property up in probate for 5 years. You make $41,000 a year, Holden. You pay child support. You rent. You will be bankrupt before the first hearing on the merits." She tilted her head almost gently. "Or you can be reasonable." He looked at her. He looked at his brother behind her. He looked at the man with the camera who had lowered it now and was watching his face with the bored, mercenary attention of a man who had been hired to document a particular outcome and was waiting to see which one it was going to be. He felt something settle in his chest. It was not anger exactly. It was not fear. It was the strange, clean stillness a man comes to when he realizes he has crossed a line he cannot go back over. "Marlene." "Yes. File your suit." She blinked. Just once. "Holden." "File it." For the first time since they were children, his sister did not have a ready answer. Her mouth opened and closed and opened again. Garrett pushed off the SUV and took a step forward, and his face had changed too. The laugh gone out of it, now replaced by something colder and more careful. "Hold. Get in your cars," Holden said. "Both of you. Take your friend with the camera. I'll see you in court." He walked back to his truck. He did not look at them as he passed. Behind him, Bishop opened his own door and climbed in, slow and deliberate, the way an old man does any number of small things, with the unhurried dignity of someone who did not need to hurry to make a point. Holden started the engine. He waited. After a long minute, Garrett got into the SUV. Marlene followed. The man with the camera got into the third car. They reversed off the dirt track in a slow, sullen line. Holden watched them go in the rearview mirror until they had disappeared onto the highway, and then he sat for another minute with his hands on the wheel and his breath coming a little too fast. Bishop did not speak. Holden finally pulled out onto the road. "You will need a lawyer," Bishop said. "I know. A good one." "I know. And Mr. Whitlock." "Yes, sir. Whatever you find in that mountain, whatever else is down there, your grandfather did not leave it to you so that you could win a fight with your sister. I have known a number of men in my life who came into late life fortunes. The ones who survived it kept their eye on the original question. Why did the one who left it leave it to me? What did he think I would do with it? The men who lost themselves were the ones who stopped asking that question and started asking instead what they could afford. Holden glanced over at him. The old geologist was looking out the window at the mountain pulling away behind them. "I'll remember that, sir." "See that you do." The lawyer Holden hired the following Monday was a man named Roland Pickett, who had practiced in Copper Hollow for 31 years. He worked out of a small office above a bank. He was in his early 60s, soft-spoken with the unhurried courtesy of a man who had learned long ago that small-town law moved on small-town time. Ellis Hargrove had recommended him without hesitation. So had Marge at the diner. So had 2 other people, Holden asked. Pickett listened to the whole story without interrupting. Holden told him everything. The will, the cabin, the hatch, the mine, Bishop's assessment, the threats. The half-siblings he had not known were half-siblings until last week. When Holden finished, Pickett took off his glasses, polished them once with a cloth from his desk drawer, and put them back on. "Mr. Whitlock," he said. "Yes, sir." "Your siblings have resources. They will use them. That is the first thing you need to accept." "I have." The second thing is that they will lose this case on the law eventually. The will is clean. The medical record is clean. Your grandfather had it drafted by an excellent estate attorney, whom I know professionally and respect personally. The diminished capacity claim is paperwork. The undue influence claim is paperwork. They will not survive a motion for summary judgment if we manage them correctly. And the third thing is that none of that will matter if they bankrupt you before we get to summary judgment. Yes. Pickett looked at him steadily. So we are going to need to do something they will not expect. He stood. He walked to the window of his small office and looked down on the main street of Copper Hollow. Tell me again about the indigenous artifacts your grandfather mentioned in his letter. That night, Holden drove back up to the cabin alone. He went through the strongbox he had found behind a false panel on his second trip. He went through the second envelope that had been waiting for him there. The longer letter, the one that explained in his grandfather's careful late-hand things Caleb Whitlock had carried alone for 67 years. That Ezra Thornbury had been Caleb's great-grandfather. That Holden was a great-great-great-grandson of the man who had cut these tunnels by hand in 1897. That Ezra had not died in a winter storm in 1903, as the old newspapers had said, but had faked his death to escape the syndicate men coming up the mountain to kill him for his strike, and had lived another 15 years under another name in another state before his heart finally gave out. That the truth had been carried generation by generation, down a thin line of women who had been told that one day a man in the family would come along who could be trusted with it. That Caleb had been told by his own mother on her deathbed in 1954 that there was something in the deepest chamber of the mind behind a stone wall that looked natural, but was not, that mattered more than the silver. Something Ezra had promised in the late summer of 1899 to a Ute elder named Tahoma, whose name appeared in the torn-out pages of the journal. The pages Caleb had hidden inside the spine of an old ledger book in a hidden archive room Holden had not yet found. Ezra had made a vow. Caleb had carried that vow forward for 67 years. He had spent the last 7 years of his life negotiating quietly with the Cultural Preservation Office of the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe, drafting an agreement that would honor the promise. The agreement had been days from signature when Caleb's heart had begun to fail. The agreement was unsigned in his desk. The promise was unkept in the mountain, and the man who had been chosen to keep it was sitting now alone in the cold cabin at midnight, with the gold pocket watch ticking on the table beside him, and his daughter sleeping safely 200 miles away in her mother's house, holding in his hands a document he had not asked for and could not refuse. Holden read the letter twice. He read the agreement once. Then he set them down. He stood and walked out onto the broken porch of the cabin. The night was very cold. The sky above the clearing was crowded with stars, more stars than a man saw anywhere near a city. The old uncountable stars his grandfather had taught him the names of when he was a boy. He could pick out the constellations. He could remember which stories went with which. You measure a man, his grandfather had said, by the promises he keeps when nobody's looking. There was no one looking now. There was only Holden Whitlock, 38 years old, history teacher, divorced, father of one grandson of Caleb, great-great-great-grandson of Ezra, the last living man on the long, thin chain of those who had been told and had agreed to carry it. There was the cold mountain at his back. There was the unsigned agreement in his hand. There was a lawsuit being drafted that night in a Denver office tower, a lawsuit that would, if it landed, cost him every dollar he had, and a number he did not yet have. He looked up at the stars for a long time. Then he went back inside, and he picked up his phone, and he wrote down the name he had been carrying since the moment he had finished his grandfather's letter. He wrote it carefully in block letters on the inside cover of Ezra Thornbury's journal. where it could not get lost. Daniel Redfeather, Ute Mountain, Ute Cultural Preservation Office, Tolteok. Tomorrow he would call. Tomorrow he would drive south. Tomorrow the second half of his grandfather's life would become his own. Tonight he sat alone in the cabin with the gold watch ticking quietly on the table, and the long shaft yawning open in the floor, and the mountain holding its breath above him the way it had been holding its breath for 127 years, waiting for a man to come who knew what it was waiting for. The town of Tawak sat in the long, flat country south of the mountains where the land remembered the shape of the wind, and the wind remembered the shape of the land. And the sky overhead was so wide it seemed to belong to no one and to everyone at the same time. Holden drove down on a Tuesday morning alone with Ezra Thornbury's journal in a sealed bag on the passenger seat, and the unsigned agreement folded inside his coat. The road south of Cortez ran straight as a chalk line for 30 miles. He passed long stretches of sagebrush and red rock, and not a single car going the other way for 10 minutes at a time. He thought about what he was going to say. He thought about what a man says to people whose great-grandparents had been promised something by a stranger more than a century before, and who had been waiting patiently for that promise to be kept. He thought about how his own great-great-great-grandfather had stood in this same country dust on his boots and silver in his pockets and had decided to keep his word. He pulled into the parking lot of the Tribal Administration Building a little before 11 in the morning. He sat in the truck for a minute with both hands on the wheel. Then he got out, and he walked across the lot, and he stepped through the front doors with his hat in his hand. Daniel Redfeather met him in the lobby. He was a man in his early 50s of medium height, with graying hair tied back at his neck, and a face that had been weathered into kindness by sun and time. He wore a plain blue shirt and jeans and a turquoise stone on a thin silver chain. He shook Holden's hand once firmly and looked at him with the unhurried attention of a man who had spent his life listening. "Mr. Whitlock, Mr. Redfeather, thank you for seeing me on short notice. Daniel, Holden. Come this way, Holden." He led Holden down a corridor lined with photographs of elders and ceremonies and land. He stopped at a small conference room. He gestured for Holden to take a chair. He poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot on a side table, and he set one down in front of Holden, and he sat across from him with his own cup steaming between his hands. He did not speak first, so Holden began slowly the way a man begins a story he has been preparing in his head for 100 miles. He told Daniel about the funeral, about the will, about the laughter in the attorney's office, about the cabin, the hatch, the tunnel, the chamber, the journal, the wire silver, about Theodore Bishop's assessment, about the second letter, the one that had told him what his name had always carried without his knowing it, about the 67 years his grandfather had carried the truth alone, about the 7 years his grandfather had spent quietly negotiating with the people across this very table. He laid the unsigned agreement on the table between them. He laid the journal beside it. He fell silent. Daniel did not pick up either document. He looked at them. He looked at Holden. He set his coffee cup down very gently on the table. "Your grandfather," he said, "came to this office 7 years ago. He sat where you are sitting. He told us what his great-grandfather had done. He told us about the sacred chambers and about Tahoma and about the promise. He told us he was an old man, and he did not know how much time he had left, but that he intended to use whatever time he had to put things right." Daniel paused. "Daniel, we worked with him on this agreement for almost 5 years. Then his health began to fail. We thought when word reached us that he had passed that the work would die with him. We had begun to grieve it. Not him only. The promise also. Promises are living things, Holden. When they go unkept long enough, they begin to die. We had begun to grieve a dying promise. Holden swallowed. "It is not dead," he said. Daniel watched him for a long moment. "No," he said. "I see that now. It is not dead." The chairman of the tribal council came to the cabin 2 days later. His name was Joseph Stillwater. He was in his early 70s, broad through the shoulders even now, with hair the color of iron, and a face that had been carved by his life into something quiet and unbreakable. He came up the dirt road in a 4-door pickup, and he brought with him Daniel Redfeather and 2 elders, a man and a woman, both older than Joseph. Both walking slowly and with great dignity, the way people walk when they have understood for a long time that there is no longer any reason to hurry. They did not speak much when they arrived. The elders looked at the cabin for a long time without going inside. They walked the perimeter of the clearing. They touched the bark of the lodgepole pines. The woman knelt and pressed her hand briefly against the ground, and she said a few words in a language Holden did not know. And then she rose slowly with Daniel's hand at her elbow. Only then did they go in. Holden led them down the ladder one at a time with great care. Joseph went first, refusing help descending the rungs the way a younger man would have, with a steady patience that admitted no weakness. The 2 elders followed. Daniel came last behind Holden. In the main chamber, the elders stood for a long while in silence. Then Holden led them deeper. He had spent the previous 2 evenings searching the deeper passages of the mine with his flashlight and Ezra's hand-drawn map, and he had found in the deepest chamber the false wall his grandfather's letter had described. It looked like nothing. It looked like a section of natural rockfall, the stones laid up in a way that mimicked the careless geometry of geology. But when Holden had run his fingers along the seams, he had felt the small, flat indents of where the stones had been deliberately fitted one against another by a man who had wanted them to be moved again someday by someone who was looking for them. He had not moved the stones. He had wanted the elders to be the first. They came to the wall now. Joseph Stillwater set his palm against it very lightly. He stood there with his hand on the stone for what felt like a long time. Then he stepped back, and he nodded once at the male elder, and the elder began in a soft voice to speak. He spoke in Ute. The words moved through the chamber and into the rock and seemed to go somewhere beyond the rock into a place Holden could not follow. Daniel did not translate. Holden understood that this was not a moment for translation. When the elder finished, the woman stepped forward. She placed both her hands flat against the stones at chest height. She closed her eyes. After a long moment, she opened them. "You may help us, please," she said to Holden in clear English, very politely, the way one neighbor asks another to lift a heavy thing. Holden helped them. The stones came out one at a time. The 4 of them worked together. Joseph and Holden lifting Daniel, steadying the male elder, receiving each stone and laying it carefully on a clean cloth he had brought down with him for that purpose. The female elder did not work with her hands. She watched. She said small things in Ute that were perhaps prayers, perhaps acknowledgments, perhaps simply the names of things being seen for the first time in more than 100 years. The wall came down in 20 minutes. Behind it was a small chamber no larger than a walk-in closet, dry and cool and untouched. And on stone shelves cut into the back wall, wrapped carefully in oilcloth and waxed paper that had been changed. Holden later realized more than once across the decades by his grandfather and his great-great-great-grandfather before him were the things that Ezra Thornbury had promised in the late summer of 1899 to keep safe. Pottery, pieces of woven reed, tools shaped from bone and from polished stone, a small effigy carved from soft wood no larger than a man's thumb. A folded textile, the colors faded but not gone. The pattern still legible to those who could read it. The elders moved into the chamber. The woman knelt before the shelves. She did not weep. She did not speak. But her hands, when she lifted them, trembled. The way the hands of any person tremble when, at last, they are returned. Something that was taken from their grandmother's grandmothers, and that they had been told for all their lives was lost. Holden stepped back into the larger chamber. He did not belong in that small room. Not for this part. Joseph Stillwater followed him out a moment later. The two men stood together in the larger chamber in the cold, with the lantern light throwing their shadows long up the granite walls. "Your grandfather," Joseph said quietly, "told me once that he had a grandson who had been chosen for this. He said it like a man speaking of a son he was proud of. I wondered sometimes what that grandson would be like. I wondered if he would come." Holden could not speak. Joseph turned his head and looked at him. His eyes in the lantern light were very dark and very still. "He would be proud of you today," Joseph said. "I want you to know that. Today in this place, your grandfather is proud of you." Holden nodded. He did not trust his voice. He simply nodded. The lawsuit was filed the following Monday. Marlene's firm sent the papers by overnight courier the way large firms always did to make a small thing feel large. Holden was at school when the courier came to his apartment building. The packet was waiting outside his door when he came home in a heavy envelope with the firm's name embossed across the corner in dark green ink. He sat down on the floor of his apartment and read it through twice. It was as bad as Roland Pickett had warned him it would be. Diminished capacity, undue influence, a request that the will be set aside in its entirety and the estate redistributed in equal thirds, a motion for an injunction to prevent any disposition of the mountain property pending the outcome of the litigation, a demand for an immediate accounting of all activities Holden had undertaken on the property since the date of inheritance. 2 declarations attached, both from physicians who had treated Caleb in his last year, both on close reading careful, not to actually say that Caleb had been incompetent, both managing in the way that paid-for declarations always managed to imply it. He photographed every page. He emailed the file to Roland. He called Roland's office and was told the lawyer was already drafting the response. Then he sat on his apartment floor with his back against the couch and his phone in his hand, and he called the only person in the world he wanted to talk to right then. His daughter. Bridget answered. She was kind. She had always been kind, even at the worst of it. And the kindness had become, over the past 2 years, the thing he was most grateful to her for. She put Wren on the phone. "Daddy." "Hi, sweetheart. How was school?" "Long." "Daddy." "Yeah." "Is something wrong?" He almost lied. The reflex was there. The old tired reflex of a parent who had decided long ago to spare his child every weight he could spare her. He set it down. "A little," he said. "Uncle Garrett and Aunt Marlene have decided to take me to court over the cabin." "Why?" "Because they think the cabin is worth something, and they want it." "Is the cabin worth something?" He smiled in spite of himself. "Yes, sweetheart. It turns out the cabin is worth something." "Does it matter?" "What?" "Does it matter that the cabin is worth something? Or does it matter what Grandpa wanted you to do with it?" He sat very still on the floor of his apartment with the phone pressed against his ear. "You are 9 years old, Wren." "Yes." "How do you know things like that?" "Grandpa told me," she said simply. He closed his eyes. He did. "He told me when we were at the lake. He said sometimes grown-ups forget the difference. He said I shouldn't forget. He said you wouldn't forget either. So I'm not going to forget, and you're not going to forget. No, sweetheart, I'm not going to forget. Okay. Okay. Daddy? Yeah. Are you scared? A little. It's okay to be scared and brave at the same time. Where did you hear that? From you. In the car, on the way to the funeral. He held the phone for a long time after they had said goodnight. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. Roland Pickett worked through the weekends. He pulled the medical records. He took depositions from Caleb's primary physician and from the housekeeper, who had cared for him in his last year. The one who had not signed Marlene's affidavit. The one who had watched Caleb every day for the last 14 months of his life, and who said on the record that the man had been sharp as a fence wire until the morning he died. He took a deposition from Edmund Halverson. He took a deposition from Ellis Hargrove. He took a deposition from Theodore Bishop. And he prepared with great care a motion to intervene on behalf of the Ute Mountain Ute tribe. That motion changed the shape of the case. When the firm representing Garrett and Marlene received the notice that the tribe was entering the action as an interested party, asserting federal heritage protections over indigenous artifacts, already in the process of being repatriated, there was a long silence on their end. Then Stanley Whitcomb, the senior partner handling the matter, called Roland Pickett's office personally. He asked in his careful, slightly condescending way whether Roland understood what an unusual posture this was. Roland said he did. Stanley asked whether his client was prepared to prove the existence of these artifacts. Roland said he was. Stanley asked what exactly the tribe was claiming. Roland said he would be happy to lay it out at the hearing. There was another silence on the line. "Mr. Pickett," Stanley said. "Yes." "Are you suggesting that this case is no longer about a will contest?" "I am suggesting," Roland said in the gentle voice of a small-town lawyer who had nothing left to prove to anyone, "that this case has not been about a will contest from the beginning. It has been about whether the man who left the property to my client understood what he was doing. The presence of a federally recognized tribe at our table on Monday will, I believe, settle that question with some finality." He paused. "Your clients are welcome to withdraw the suit at any time before the hearing, without prejudice to their dignity. I will not advise my client to oppose such a withdrawal." Stanley Whitcomb did not withdraw the suit. Holden suspected later that he had urged it on his clients, and that they had refused. Garrett and Marlene had come too far. They had told too many people about the case. To withdraw now would have looked to the world they cared about like losing. So they walked into the courthouse. The Copper Hollow County Courthouse was a brick building from 1908, with a small white cupola and a flagpole, and a set of stone steps that had been worn into a soft curve by 117 years of feet, going up and coming down. Judge Morrissey presided. She was a woman in her early 60s with a cap of iron-gray hair and a face that admitted nothing. She had been on that bench for 19 years. She had seen as Edmund Halverson had once seen a great many families come undone over money, and she had stopped being surprised by any of it. Holden sat at the petitioner's table with Roland on his left, and a manila folder of his grandfather's letters on the chair beside him. At the other table sat Garrett and Marlene with Stanley Whitcomb in a charcoal suit and 2 associates, one on each side, both of them younger than Holden. And both of them Holden could tell from the way they moved, absolutely certain that this hearing was going to be over by lunchtime. In the gallery in the second row sat Daniel Redfeather and Joseph Stillwater. Behind them, 3 Ute elders. 2 rows behind the elders in his Sunday jacket and his clean white shirt sat Ellis Hargrove. In the back row, in a pressed tweed suit that looked older than he was, sat Theodore Bishop. Holden had not asked any of them to come. They had all come anyway. The hearing began at 9. Stanley Whitcomb opened. He was good. Holden had been afraid he would be good. Stanley made the case as cleanly as such a case could be made. The will was facially irrational. The disparity in the bequests was extreme. The deceased had made significant changes to his estate plan in the last 18 months of his life during a period in which his cognitive functioning could be questioned. The grandchild who had benefited disproportionately from those changes had become increasingly involved in the deceased's affairs in the same period. The court should, at minimum, set the will aside for further factual development. He sat down. Roland stood. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture. He spoke as if he were having a conversation with the judge about a matter of mutual interest. He laid out the medical record. He laid out the careful, multi-month process by which Caleb had drafted the will with Edmund Halverson. He laid out the witness statements he had gathered. He laid out in a single clean paragraph the fact that the petitioners had visited their grandfather a combined total of 6 times in the last 2 years of his life, and that during the same period the respondent had visited him no fewer than 31 times, including the last 3 weekends before his death. He sat down. Marlene took the stand first. Stanley walked her through her direct examination with the practiced ease of a man who had prepared this witness for a week. She testified about her grandfather's confusion in his last year, about forgotten names, about repeated stories, about the small lapses that had in her professional judgment indicated a deteriorating mind. Roland rose for cross-examination. He smiled at her faintly the way a man smiles at a person he has known a long time and wishes he did not have to do this to. "Mrs. Halloran," he said. "Mr. Pickett, when was the last time you visited your grandfather before his death?" A small pause. "Approximately 8 months prior." 8 months prior. "And in the year before that, Mrs. Halloran, how many times did you visit him?" "Twice. 3 visits in 2 years. I have a demanding career." "Yes, ma'am, I'm sure you do. And during those 3 visits, did your grandfather ever express confusion to you about his estate planning?" "Not directly." "Did he ever ask you to come more often?" A longer pause. "He understood I was busy. Or perhaps, Mrs. Halloran, he understood that you were not interested in coming." Stanley objected. The judge sustained it. The point had landed all the same. Garrett took the stand next. He did worse than his sister. Because Garrett had less practice at this kind of thing and more pride to defend. Roland's cross-examination of him took 12 minutes. By the end, Garrett's face was the color of the wood paneling behind him, and the older of Stanley's 2 associates had begun very quietly to take notes that he would not be sharing with his client. Then it was Roland's turn to put on the defense. He called Edmund Halverson, who testified calmly and at length that Caleb Whitlock had been entirely competent, that the will had been the product of 3 separate meetings over 6 months, that Caleb had reviewed every line that Caleb had said in Halverson's office, looking up across that same wood-paneled desk, that Holden was the right one because Holden would understand its true worth. He called Theodore Bishop, who testified about the property's geological significance and about the level of expertise required to maintain a mine of that age, in the condition Caleb had maintained it in, and about the precision of the documentation Caleb had produced over decades. He testified in his quiet, dry, scientific way that he had known Caleb Whitlock only through the man's records, and that those records were not the records of a confused mind. He called Ellis Hargrove, who testified in his plain, unhurried way that Caleb had been sharp as a tack until the day he died, and that he had told Ellis the last time Caleb had come into the store that he was leaving the mountain property to Holden, and had said in those exact words that Holden had the heart to know what it meant. Then Roland called Daniel Redfeather. Daniel walked to the stand and sat down with the same unhurried dignity he had brought to every room Holden had ever seen him enter. He was sworn in. He folded his hands in his lap. "Mr. Redfeather," Roland said, "will you tell the court who you are and why you are here?" Daniel told them. He told them about the office he held. He told them in a steady voice that did not rise above conversational about the 7 years he had spent in negotiation with Caleb Whitlock, about the artifacts in the deepest chamber of the mine, about the promise made in 1899 by Holden's great-great-great-grandfather to a Ute elder named Tahoma, about the unsigned agreement his grandfather had drafted with such care, and about the willingness of Holden Whitlock this past month to honor it. Stanley Whitcomb at the petitioner's table did not move. His clients did. Garrett's hands had gone flat against the table in front of him. Marlene's mouth had opened very slightly, and stayed open the way a mouth opens when it is trying to find a sentence that is not there to be found. Judge Morrissey leaned forward. "Mr. Redfeather, Your Honor, you are saying that there are indigenous heritage objects on this property?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Objects subject to federal protection?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And that Mr. Whitlock, the respondent, is in the process of repatriating those objects to your tribe?" "He is." The judge sat back. She turned slowly and looked at Stanley Whitcomb. "Counsel, Your Honor, were your clients aware of this aspect of the property when they filed their petition?" Stanley hesitated. It was, Holden saw clearly, the worst hesitation of his career. "They were not, Your Honor." The judge's eyes moved briefly to Garrett and Marlene, and then back to Stanley. "Perhaps," she said very quietly, "if your clients had taken more interest in their grandfather's life while he was living it, they would have known." Stanley sat down. The hearing did not end there. There was one more piece of evidence. Roland had saved it. He had told Holden the night before that he wanted to save it. He had said that there was a moment in every hearing when the judge needed to be given something to anchor her ruling to, and that this moment when it came would feel obvious, and that he would know it. He stood now. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, the respondent would like to present one additional piece of evidence. A video recording made by the deceased Caleb Whitlock 2 weeks before his death in the office of Edmund Halverson in the presence of Mr. Halverson, and a notary public, both of whom can authenticate the recording and confirm the circumstances of its making." Stanley rose immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. This is highly irregular. It is properly authenticated, Your Honor," Roland said gently. "We will lay the foundation. The deceased made it for precisely this purpose." The judge looked at the document Roland slid across the bench. "I'll allow it," she said. "Lay your foundation." Halverson took the stand briefly. He testified that yes, he had been present. Yes, the recording was authentic. Yes, Caleb Whitlock had asked very specifically that it be presented in any future legal challenge to his will. The bailiff brought a screen into the courtroom. He set it up at the front of the gallery, angled so that the judge, the petitioner's table, the respondent's table, and the gallery could all see it. He plugged in a small projector. The lights in the courtroom dimmed. The screen flickered on. And there, suddenly sitting at a wood-paneled conference table in a brown cardigan and a neatly buttoned shirt, was Caleb Whitlock. He was thinner than Holden had expected, older. The hands folded on the table in front of him had grown more bone than flesh in the months Holden had not seen him. But his eyes were clear. His eyes had the same direct, patient focus Holden had grown up under. Caleb cleared his throat. "My name is Caleb Whitlock. I am being recorded today of my own free will and in full possession of my faculties. The date is October the 18th, 2021. I am recording this in anticipation of challenges to my will after my death." A small breath in the courtroom. Garrett's eyes had not moved from the screen. I have left certain assets to my grandchildren Garrett and Marlene, who are not in the strict sense my biological grandchildren, but who I have considered my own since the day they came back into my life as teenagers. I have left them assets sufficient to live on. I have not left them everything because they would have spent it badly. I say that without anger. I have known them their whole lives. I know what they value, and I know what they do not value, and I am telling the truth about it now, because there is no longer any reason not to. Marlene's hand had gone to her mouth. "My grandson Holden," Caleb said, and his voice on the screen softened just slightly. The way a man's voice softens when he speaks of a person he has loved, has inherited the mountain property at Copper Ridge. The property contains more than most people understand. It contains a working silver vein. It contains the journal of my great-grandfather. It contains certain objects sacred to the Ute people, which were promised to them more than 100 years ago, and which it is now time to return. A pause. Garrett and Marlene, if you are watching this, it means you have done what I expected you to do. I am not angry at you. I am sad. There is a difference. You have spent your lives measuring the world in dollars. There are things in that mountain that cannot be measured in dollars. If I had left them to either of you, you would have sold them within a year. Holden will not. Holden was raised by a different mother, by a man who took him fishing, by a grandfather who told him stories. He will know what to do with what I have left him, because I taught him year after year what those things were for. Caleb leaned forward slightly toward the camera. His eyes seemed in that moment to find Holden through the screen across the months, across the grave. Holden, if you are watching this in a courtroom, then I was right about your brother and sister. Don't let it wound you. They are who they are. You are who you are. You are not fighting them for money. You are fighting them for the principle that promises matter. That heritage matters. That a man's word is not a thing to be sold off when a richer offer comes along. Stand firm, son. I am proud of you. I have been proud of you since you were 10 years old, and I have been proud of you every single day since. He stopped. He looked at the camera for one more long beat, the way a man looks at a face he is saying goodbye to. That is all, he said. Thank you. The screen went dark. The courtroom was completely silent. It stayed silent for a long time. Holden could not see Garrett's face. He did not need to. He could see his brother's shoulders. He could see the way Garrett had folded forward just slightly, with both hands flat on the table in front of him, the way a man does when something he had been carrying has just been lifted off of him, in a way he did not invite and cannot now refuse. Marlene had not moved. Judge Morrissey did not speak immediately. When she did speak, her voice was the voice of a woman who had decided what she was going to say. A long time before this morning, and had only been waiting for the record to give her the opening. I have heard enough, she said. She looked down at the petitioner's table. The will contest is denied. The evidence overwhelmingly establishes that Caleb Whitlock was of full mental capacity and that his testamentary intent was both clear and considered. The undue influence claim is without merit on the record before me and will not be revisited. She paused. I will say one further thing. I have been a judge for 19 years. I have presided over a number of will contests in that time. I have seen disappointed heirs do many things. I have not, in my 19 years on this bench, seen a deceased man predict the behavior of his own family with the clarity that Caleb Whitlock has just demonstrated. That is not a compliment to the petitioners. It is a comment on the evidence. She set her pen down. This matter is dismissed, with prejudice. She rose. The bailiff called the room. Everyone stood. The judge left the bench. And then slowly, one row at a time, the courtroom began to empty. Stanley Whitcomb gathered his papers without speaking. He did not look at his clients. He did not have to. The two associates packed their briefcases with the small, efficient motions of young men who had just learned something they were going to remember for the rest of their careers. Marlene was the first of the petitioners to stand. She did not look at Holden as she passed. She walked out of the courtroom with her chin up and her purse held tightly under her arm, the way a woman walks who has decided that she is going to think about today later, when she is alone and is not going to think about it now. Garrett did not stand. He sat at the petitioner's table for a long minute after his sister had gone, with his hands still flat on the wood, looking at the dark screen at the front of the gallery. Roland touched Holden's elbow. "Take a minute," he said quietly. Holden took a minute. Then he got up and he walked across the aisle and he sat down in the chair Marlene had left. His brother did not look up. For a long time, neither of them spoke. "He really did know us," Garrett said finally. His voice was low. It was hoarse the way a man's voice is hoarse when he hasn't used it in a while. "He did. He saw it coming. Every minute of it. He sat there in that office and he made a tape because he knew exactly what we were going to do." "Yes." Garrett shook his head slowly. He laughed once, very quietly. The laugh had no joy in it. It was almost a sob. "Hold. Yeah. Was there ever a chance for us, for me, to be the kind of person he could trust?" Holden looked at his brother. He looked at the man Garrett had become, and at the boy Garrett had once been. The boy who had ridden up to the cabin once, only once, and had complained about the bugs, and had refused to come back, and had spent the next 30 years not knowing what he had refused. He looked at the way Garrett's hands were folded together on the table now, the way a child folds his hands when he has been told to. "There still is," he said. "How?" "Start by understanding that there are things in this world that matter more than money. You don't have to do anything else for a long time. Just start there." Garrett did not answer right away. When he did not look up. "I don't know if I can. You don't have to know yet. You just have to start." His brother nodded once. That was all. Holden stood up. He laid his hand briefly on Garrett's shoulder, the way Caleb had laid his hand on a 10-year-old boy's shoulder in a photograph a long time ago. Then he walked out of the courtroom into the bright, cold afternoon of the Colorado autumn. 6 months passed. The seasons turned over the mountain, the way seasons always turned over that mountain, without comment, without ceremony, without paying any attention to the small affairs of the men below it. The snow came. The snow melted. The first green threads of new grass came up through the duff in the clearing where the cabin stood, and the lodgepole pines released their pollen in long yellow clouds in the high spring wind. The mine had been sealed, properly, professionally. A new steel door had been installed at the top of the shaft, with a heavy lock and a single key, which Holden carried on a small chain inside his coat. The wire silver from the chamber had gone in carefully documented stages to the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, where it now anchored a permanent exhibit on Colorado's mining history. 10% of the proceeds from the sale of the documented samples had been deposited into a fund administered jointly by Holden and the Ute Mountain Ute Tribal Council, dedicated to cultural preservation programs. The remaining vein in the mountain had not been touched. It would not be touched, not in Holden's lifetime at least. Whether his daughter, when she was a grown woman, would decide differently was a question Holden had decided not to answer for her. He had locked the door. He had drawn up papers placing the property in a long-term family trust with strict provisions about consultation and consent. He had made the future her question to ask when she was ready to ask it. Caleb had waited 67 years. Holden could wait however long it needed to be waited. The sacred chamber had been cleared. The artifacts had been transferred with great care to the tribe. The two elders who had come up that first day had since passed. They had passed having seen with their own eyes the things their great-grandmothers had been told were lost. Daniel Redfeather had told Holden the last time they spoke that the woman elder had said on the drive back to Tawaok that day that she could die now without the small ache she had been carrying. Daniel had said it as a gift. Holden had received it as one. The dedication ceremony took place on a clear afternoon in late spring. It was small. Caleb would have wanted it small. Maybe 50 people stood in the clearing. Daniel Redfeather, Joseph Stillwater, 3 elders, a handful of tribal members, Theodore Bishop in his old tweed suit, Roland Pickett, Edmund Halverson, who had driven up from Denver in a clean dark coat and had stood the whole ceremony with his hat held in front of him with both hands, Ellis Hargrove and Marge from the diner, the director of the Denver Museum. Bridget had come, which had surprised Holden, and had brought Wren in a pale blue dress. Garrett came. Holden had not invited him. Holden had not invited him. He had simply sent him the date and the time on a postcard with no commentary, and had let his brother decide. Garrett came. He stood at the back of the small crowd, alone in a dark suit, with his hands folded in front of him, the way a man stands at a service when he is trying very hard to be present and is not yet sure how to do it. He did not approach Holden during the ceremony. He did not approach him after. He simply stood there the entire time and listened. Marlene did not come. There was a bronze plaque mounted on a piece of native granite at the head of the trail, leading up to the sealed mine. It bore 3 names: Ezra Thornberry, 1847 to 1918. Caleb Whitlock, 1930 to 2021. And in the place where the 3rd name might have been a single carved line that read, "And to the Ute people who knew this mountain as sacred long before either of them were born." The senior elder of the day, a man Holden had not met before, performed a blessing. He spoke in Ute. Daniel translated portions of it afterward. The blessing thanked the mountain. It thanked those who had come before. It thanked with a kindness that startled Holden when Daniel spoke the words to him. The man in the dark suit standing at the back of the crowd, who had come to bear witness to a thing he did not yet fully understand. Wren stood beside Holden through the whole ceremony. She had brought in her own small hands a wrapped frame. When the formal portion ended, she walked with her mother's encouragement and her father's hand at her back across the clearing to the elders, and she handed the frame up to the eldest of the women. Inside the frame was the photograph. Holden had taken it. It showed the deepest chamber of the mine with the false wall still standing untouched, the way they had found it. The photograph had been printed large on heavy paper and matted in a simple wooden frame. "So you remember," Wren said in her careful, clear voice, "what my dad and my grandpa kept safe for you." The elder accepted the photograph. She knelt with great difficulty and removed from her own wrist a thin woven bracelet. She tied it gently around Wren's small wrist, the way an old woman ties a thread to a child's wrist when she means for the child to carry something forward into the world. She spoke in Ute a few words. Daniel translated. "This is a sign of covenant," he said. "Your father has honored the old ways. You will carry this forward when he is gone." Wren nodded. "I promise," she said. Afterward, when most of the crowd had drifted down toward the cars, Holden walked back up to the cabin. Wren went with him. They sat on the porch he had repaired carefully over the winter with new boards in the worst places, and old boards left wherever the old boards still held. They sat side by side and looked out across the clearing as the sun began to lower itself behind the western peaks. The light went gold, then orange, then red. Daddy. Yeah, sweetheart. Do you think Grandpa knows? He thought about it. I think he knew before we did, he said. I think he knew the whole time. She leaned against him. Uncle Garrett came, she said. He did. Is he going to be okay? I think he might be. Eventually, Aunt Marlene didn't come. No. Why? Because some people need a longer road to walk before they get to the same place. That's all. It doesn't mean she won't ever get there. She accepted this. The sun touched the ridge. Holden stood after a while and went inside the cabin. He came back out carrying the leather-bound journal of Ezra Thornbury and a fountain pen. He sat back down beside his daughter. He opened the journal to the first blank page after the last of his great-great-great-grandfather's entries, where he had begun weeks before to write his own. He uncapped the pen. He wrote the date. Then, slowly in his own careful hand, in the language of a man writing to a man he knew, was not there to read it, but who he believed would somehow read it anyway. He wrote a few lines. We honored your promise today. The mountain is protected. The artifacts have been returned. Wren wears a bracelet on her wrist. Garrett came. Marlene did not. There is still a road for both of them. I will keep the door closed and the watch wound, and I will be here when they are ready. You were right about everything. Time revealed all truths. Thank you. He closed the journal. He set it on the porch boards beside him. He drew the gold pocket watch from his coat pocket, as he had drawn it 10,000 times in the months since the funeral, and he turned it over in his palm. And he ran his thumb across the engraving on the back, the way Caleb had run his thumb across it for 67 years. To Holden, time reveals all truths. The watch was warm. The watch was always warm. Beside him, his daughter laid her head against his shoulder. The sun went behind the ridge. The clearing filled slowly with the long blue shadow of the mountain. Somewhere up the slope, a single owl called once and was silent. The first stars came out one at a time in the deepening sky above the lodgepole pines. The old uncountable stars whose names a grandfather had taught a boy in a boat on a still lake on a morning 30 years before. Holden Whitlock, 38 years old. History teacher, divorced father of one, sat on the porch of a falling-down cabin that the world had once told him was worth $5, and held in his hand the only inheritance that had ever truly mattered. It was not the silver in the mountain. It was not the cabin under his feet. It was the slow, hard knowledge that an old man he had loved had looked at him across the long years of his life and had seen something true. That a promise made in a quiet office in 1899 had been kept. That a promise made on a deathbed in 1954 had been kept. That a promise made in a pocket watch in 1955, the year his father had been born, had been kept. That the chain had not broken on his watch. That he had become at last the man his grandfather had always known he was. The watch ticked on. The mountain held its silence. And the night came down gently and slowly, the way night comes down on a country that has been told the truth at last and has agreed in its old patient way to keep that truth safe for whoever came next.